Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. This video I'm continuing my theories of ethnicity and nationalism. We completed section 1 in the last installment. I'm going to go to section 1.1 in the notes. If this is the first time that you're watching the video, the notes, access to the notes are in the description field. Just click the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. Download the document. The notes are complete. And section 1.1 begins on page 3. So I'll be on page 3 of the notes. Move this out the way. And with that, let's begin. So this is theories of ethnicity and nationalism. And this is section 1.1. Okay, so we're going to be looking at ethnicity and ethnic groupings. So that's the context. The book is still the same. We'll be looking, if you look on the first page, the book is going to be, and the book changes throughout the lecture series. I use different books in different sections. We're still using American ethnicity, the dynamics and consequences of discrimination. So just click that link if you want to get the book, purchase the book, and use that to facilitate your reading. Okay, so ethnicity and ethnic groupings. All right, so the first thing, the thesis, the underlying assumption that ethnic groups exist. The underlying assumption is that there is an existential thing. There is an ontological, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but there is, we just started, right? There is an existence of ethnic groups that, when we talk about ethnic groups, they refer to something in the real world, right? An ethnic group is a thing. This thing exists in the world, and that's our main assumption. So our assumption is that ethnic groups exist. So the underlying assumption that ethnic groups exist. So ethnic groups, aka ethnic subpopulations, and the definition that has been provided is the following. Quote, a number of interacting individuals already distinguished by their ethnicity. So a number of interacting individuals already distinguished by their ethnicity. A subpopulation of individuals who are labeled and categorized by the general population. And we talked about the distinctions in population and subpopulation in the last section, in section 1.0. For example, in the United States of America, Americans, population, subpopulation, any of the quote-unquote hyphenated Americans, right? Including white Americans. So the idea is the interactivity, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. The interacting individuals already distinguished by their ethnicity, a subpopulation of individuals who are labeled and categorized by the general population. Note, the ascription of the label, and we talked about labeling yesterday briefly, is itself a consequence of the general population. Okay, quite a bit here, so let's take time and deconstruct, not in the Derridean sense, but let's take time and sort of parse through the significance of some of these things. So let's go back and look at the key assumption, right? We're assuming that ethnic groups exist. And in terms of ethnic groups, we have the population, so this would be the population. And the population is comprised of subpopulations. So the population is America, American, and then we might have Black, Asian, Hispanic, Okay, so we have the population, we have a subpopulation, and then we have the interaction between individuals within the subpopulation. Okay, so we have the population, we have the subpopulation, and then we have the interaction between individuals of a subpopulation. So with that, let's read it again, right? So ethnicity and ethnic groups. The assumption is that ethnic groups exist. Well, if we're talking about the interaction between individuals of a subpopulation, then the ethnic group would be defined by the nexus, the interrelational nexus. There's really no other way to say it, right? The interrelational nexus of interactions between individuals within a subpopulation, right? And I'll explain this more in a bit. So, a number of interacting individuals already distinguished by their ethnicity, a number of interacting individuals already distinguished by their ethnicity. A subpopulation of individuals who are labeled and categorized by the general population. Now, the ascription of the label is itself a consequence of the general population. So, what's important to ask ourselves, since this diagram, I think, sort of succinctly demonstrates how we can conceptualize this, the only thing we have to ask ourselves about is the nature of the ascription. Right? The nature of the ascription. What is the nature of the ascription? And what the author says is that the dominant population, right? The ascription of the label is itself a consequence of the general population. The general population, we have to ask ourselves, how is it that we come to identify segments within the subpopulation? Remember, we're making the assumption that ethnic groups do in fact exist. The question is, how do we come about the understanding of the existence of ethnic groups? The first thing that we need to realize is that the basis in which this concept of ethnic groups is legitimized is by the interaction between members of the population who have already been subgrouped, and within that subgroup they interact. So it makes sense to say that, wow, I see 3 Asian guys at the mall sitting talking to each other, that they constitute a group of Asian Americans, right? Their interaction facilitates me legitimizing the group. I see them interact. They seem to, I know this sounds sort of pejorative, but this is just so that you understand. They seem to already click up or interact together. In terms of their interaction, I recognize by no chance of, it isn't because of chance, right? It's not capricious, that they tend to be members of the same ethnicity. So that I reinforce the concept of ethnicity because, wow, there's 8 black guys sitting at the corner talking to each other, right? Their interaction constitutes the attempt by the general population to label the group as a subpopulation, right? That labeling is contingent primarily now on phenotypic distinction from the general population. Based on that phenotypic distinction, coupled with the interaction among members who share the same phenotypic distinction, the general population legitimizes the categorization of a subgroup, to be technical. And I apologize, we just started. Let me get my coffee. We just started, but that's the nature of the game. So the subgroup is legitimized by the general population because as a consequence of the grouping and the interaction of those who share phenotypic distinctions, to be technical. So what ends up happening is the ascription is contingent on the phenotypic distinctions of those who interact within subgroups. So I say, well, they seem to be black guys that are talking, and they are consolidated together, they're interacting together. And you can imagine from a theoretical standpoint, right? We're talking about theoretically sort of the conditions that led to groupings. It makes complete sense. Nobody in their right mind would say, oh, well, I don't understand or I don't see ethnic groups. Of course we see ethnic groups. We see ethnic groups. In another series, not in this series, but in my race and racism in America series, I think that's the name of it, I'm going to talk about the conditions of seeing ethnicity and seeing race. It's far more abstract than is necessary for this lecture series. But the idea is, as a matter of fact, we do see ethnic groupings. The assumption is, however, that because we see ethnic groupings, they exist independent to our social construction, which is clearly false, right? If we make the assumption, or not even the assumption, since we've recognized in the first lecture series that race is a myth, and thus ethnicity also is a myth. We have to arrive at the conclusion that all of those distinctions, social distinctions, that are themselves contingent on either race or ethnicity are themselves mythical, which would necessitate the mythological status of ethnic groupings to be technical. So that's where this is going. I'm sort of jumping ahead here. I hope that isn't too out there, but it should be clear, and I'll explain why and how in a bit. Right? So, last quick recap so that we're on the same plane here. One, we recognize subpopulations within the population. Our recognition of subpopulations within the main population is contingent on the interaction of individuals who share phenotypic distinctions from the general population. Since they, members of the subpopulation, are already interacting, and their interaction is visibly identified by distinctions in phenotype, we, the general population, ascribe a label to the subpopulation based on those criteria, those two criteria. Okay, so that should be clear. So now I'm going to change authors. I just wanted to establish sort of the discussion of ethnicity and ethnic groupings. The reference, as you can see, is from Ethnicity, Nationalism, and Minority Rights. The specific section in the book is Ethnicity Without Groups, and the author is Rogers Burbaker. Sorry about pronunciation on names, but you can link to the author's website if you want to go see more about him. I was intrigued by the challenge to the assumption of ethnic groupings. I wanted to incorporate that into the lecture series. You know, in preparing these lecture series, I go through and look at any number of texts and select what I think are sort of the most novel ideas to incorporate and sort of give to you guys and gals, guys and gals. You know, guys and gals, guys is general, guys and gals. And the idea that we would challenge the notion of ethnic groupings, I think, is important. So I wanted to make sure that I incorporate that. All right. So this is the original thesis. So we'll label this as the thesis. And we'll make a division, and then we'll talk about the antithesis. Okay. So this is the original thesis, and now we'll talk about the antithesis. So, antithesis. The underlying counter-argument challenges the assumption regarding the existence of groups, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to challenge the assumption of groups of people based on their ethnicity. So we're actually going to challenge the assumption of ethnic groupings, right? So we begin by challenging the assumption of ethnic groups. Alright. So here's a key concept. The concept group has remained curiously unscrutinized in recent years. This is a direct quote, right? The concept group, from the author, has remained curiously unscrutinized in recent years. What the author wants to do is challenge the assumption of groups. It seems as though groups are real. Why? Because when I say groups, I could objectively verify the referent for the word group, right? I say groups. What do you mean by groups? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people there. Group. What the author wants to do is to challenge this assumption and to show that this idea of ethnic group is not an objective criteria wholly, but that the assumption when we're talking about ethnic groups is itself socially constructed, and to understand the nature of the social construction of groups. So what does he do? What does he do? He introduces this new concept, groupism. Right. So we're going to look into the nature of groupism, and this is how the author defines groupism. The tendency to take discrete, sharply differentiated, internally homogeneous, and externally bounded groups as basic constituents of social life. Pretty complex definition. The tendency to take discrete, sharply differentiated, internally homogeneous, externally bounded group as basic constituents of social life. Okay, So the tendency to take discrete, sharply differentiated. Discrete and differentiated, right? Black, Asian, Hispanic, discrete and differentiated. Blacks are not Asians, Asians are not black, blacks are not Hispanic, Hispanics are not black, and on and on and on, right? Now, granted, we understand that there's overlap, right? But in terms of the group, we want to make clear distinctions as to the nature of the group. So we're going to be very discreet in what criteria count for inclusion or exclusion in or from the group. One. The next thing is that they are internally homogeneous. Internally, we understand what the characteristics of quote-unquote black are, right? We could even challenge some of this definitional assumption. We don't have to be super critical here. One addendum, one addition that could potentially be added to this has to do with colorism. So in terms of black population, there is a spectrum. In terms of Hispanic population, Asian population, definitely black, there's tons of literature written on this. It's the first thing that came to my mind. Internally homogeneous is important, but we need to recognize, so not to critique the author, but to add, in addition to what's been said, in terms of that homogeneity, there are spectrums, there's a gradation in terms of homogeneity. Colorism within the ethnic group Black American is important, and it really is a color spectrum of skin shade. It's rather unfortunate that in 2013 we have to still be talking about colorism. It sounds very, very antiquated. We've got like cyborg robotic eyes on the horizon, and we're talking about variations in people's skin color. But that's the nature of this lecture series, right? So the tendency to take discrete, sharply differentiated, internally homogeneous, including sort of a spectrum of homogeneity, and externally bounded groups as basic constituents of social life. So we take it for granted. We take this to be basic constituents of our social life. No one challenges, no one questions the assumption that ethnic groups exist as an ontological fact. Why? Because we can see it. Because we can identify the homogeneous nature of what constitutes the ethnic group. And insofar as we can see it, and insofar as we can justify why we have differentiated blacks from Asians, that ability, objectively, to make these distinctions and differentiations legitimizes the belief that they exist. That should be clear. Okay, so groupism tends to be essentializing, generalizing, and homogenizing. Groupism tends to be essentializing, generalizing, and homogenizing. So let's look into this idea now. So we have an idea of the thesis. I just need more space, sorry. So the assumption or the assertion is, when we talk about groupism, we realize that we're going to make distinctions, right? We're going to make distinctions in type. So this would be a typological distinctions. T-Y-P-O-L-O-G-I-C-A-L. N-E-T. We're going to make typological distinctions in ethnicity. I did this in my last lecture series in section 1, so we would have Asian, Black, Caucasian. And insofar as we make these distinctions, the author says, in my application, the author didn't say it, this was me saying it, but one of the problems is that these distinctions essentialize, homogenize, and generalize groups. Why? Because in terms of the black population, this distinction is based, as we said, on a spectrum, right? So colorism, as an example, which is discrimination based on sort of skin color. I was born in Jamaica. Anywhere in the Caribbean, in the colonial world, former colonial world, there was an institution set up of racism based on color, wherein those individuals within the population, more mulatto, got more privilege because of their mixed color, because of their mixed blood, if you will, because of their resemblance to the dominant social class. And those further and further and further removed, those darker in skin color, were marginalized and discriminated based on their color alone. So that the idea is, so we might have sort of a spectrum, right, this might be a spectrum. So there might be there is a spectrum of color within the black typological ethnicity. And one of the problems of groupism is that groupism tends to homogenize all black into one type. And this is problematic, right? This isn't specific enough. And the author is right? This is why I incorporated this into the lecture series. I think the author should be commended for his recognition of this fact, right? So groupism tends to essentialize, generalize, and homogenize. I just explained that. We have an idea of what that means. When we talk about Asian Americans, there is a wide spectrum of what constitutes Asian Americans. And there's also, remember from the thesis, which I just erased, but remember from the thesis, the interactivity between members of the group. You might see members interacting, black people interacting, black Americans interacting, but they might be Caribbean American. They might happen to be black, and black Jamaicans or black Haitians might not interact with black Americans. And you make the assumption, as an observer from the general population, that, look, the interaction of members who share the same phenotypic distinction constitutes an ethnic group. But again, this generalizes and homogenizes. Why? Because there's already distinctions that have been made, right? Yes, we phenotypically are quote-unquote black. Our skin color is not phenotypically black, but just to go with these assumptions here and these words. But our culture is distinct. It's really a cultural association that you're seeing. More than any genetic association, we, those members of the community that you see and label as interacting, it's our cultural similarity that allows us to interact, or it is our generational similarity, or it's a religious similarity, or it's a musical similarity, aesthetical, and so on and so forth, right? So the idea that because individuals share the same skin color, because individuals share the same ethnicity, in and of itself, that sharing of ethnicity, that sharing of quote-unquote kinship, would constitute the grounds for interaction and peaceable interaction, you know, at that, is absurd. When we get to nationalism, we'll see how complicated this gets, and especially when we're talking about competition for resources and such, ethnicity might not be enough, right? When we're talking about power, and power sort of trumps all of those ethnical bonds, as we'll see in a bit. Okay, so last line on page 3. This idea is reinforced by tautological argumentation, and here's the argument. This is a direct quote. Quote, "We need to break with the seemingly obvious and uncontroversial point that ethnic conflict, A, involves conflict between ethnic groups." Okay, ethnic conflict, A, involves conflict between ethnic groups. A, what does that mean? It's tautological because, in terms of groupism, this tautology, oops, so I'll explain tautology briefly. A equals A. I mean, it's obviously true, right? A equals A. So if we say ethnic conflict, involves conflict between ethnic groups. Conflict between. I haven't said anything new. I've said exactly the same thing. Ethnic conflict involves conflict between ethnic groups. I haven't said anything new. I've just restated what I've already said. Ethnic conflict involves conflict between ethnic groups. What the author is doing in this is he is challenging the legitimacy of the nature of the group, right? The group, ethnic, well, I want to demonstrate that ethnic groups do in fact exist. So what I would do is I would go into the world and talk about conflict between ethnic groups. Can't you see here that the group A, I mean, if you think in the deep American South, white Americans, or just sort of Anglo-Caucasians, after the Civil War were in deep conflict, and still are to some extent conflict with African Americans in the population. Things have changed drastically. There's certain truth to that. I mean, this is obvious. You know, children learn this in school. Well, okay, because they're in conflict then, because blacks and whites were in conflict at one point in our history, then that nature, the nature of that conflict constitutes the identity of both groups, because you couldn't have conflict unless there was group 1 battling group 2, unless it was blacks battling whites or whites battling blacks. I mean, true, there's truth to that, but what have you said? You haven't said anything, right? You've looked at something in the world, you've seen the existence of something in the world, and you've used that existence to reinforce what you've said. That's not how the scientific method works, right? The idea of science is to challenge the assumptions that you have, make a hypothesis, go out, test to be able to verify that these things have in fact occurred. They do in fact exist. But the idea that I would just simply look at some phenomena in the world and then make generalizations based on what I've seen without assessing the legitimacy of what I've seen is problematic. Why? For any number of reasons, right? We can be deceived. We might not fully understand the nature of the phenomena. Anybody who's been in graduate school for any amount of time knows that this isn't a good means of constructing your narrative of the existence of something, is by what you've seen. If eyewitness account is in and of itself the only reference that you have for legitimizing your position, you have a pretty weak position, right? I saw a group of whites battling a group of blacks, and because I saw a group of whites battling a group of blacks, that observation constitutes ethnic group white, ethnic group black. If that's your argument, you got a really weak argument, right? Eyewitness account is about as bad as it gets in terms of sort of legitimization, right? You want something more substantial. We'll talk about what that will be in a bit, but I just want to show, sort of demonstrate the obviousness, hopefully, that we're going to need substantially more than just that. Okay, so basically A equals A, which is true, but it adds no additional meaning, right? So that, okay, I can see how you would have labeled one group and another group as groups based on some interpopulation, intergroup conflict, but that doesn't constitute what you've done in order to identify and legitimize the nature of the group. And that becomes the question, right? What exactly is the nature of the ethnical grouping? Not so much how might I identify an ethnical group. That's easy to do, right? The identification of the group is, and I want to make sure that this is clear, right? The identification of the phenomena and the answer that you give to the identification of the phenomena is different from what constitutes the phenomena. Two completely different things. To say I've identified something in the world is different from saying what constitutes the thing that I've identified. When we're talking about ethnical groupings, it's not so much that you have an ability to identify an ethnical group that is of any consequence. What's important is the criteria that are necessary in order to legitimize the constituent elements of the group. That's important. If you're not asking about the conditions for the constituent elements of group identification, then you're not doing anything productive, right? I know I got technical there, and you guys will have to forgive me. I feel like I need to shift past the ghetto philosophy and just jump into the jargon, because otherwise my language is constrained. But that's the idea. That's what we're going to be looking for, right? We're going to be looking for and assessing and making a distinction between group identification as an observational reality, which is very, very surface level, very, very basic, and saying if we're going to talk about ethnical group identification, it's not about the identification that we put emphasis, it's on the constituent elements that result in or legitimize group identification. We need to know what that is. If we can't formalize something consistent there, the author's going to say, well, we need to relinquish this assumption, at least theoretically. Practically and socially, maybe we can keep it, but at least theoretically, we're going to have to relinquish the assumption that groups exist as a phenomenon, an actual phenomena in the world, and transform our assumptions that groups and group identification are, like many other things, socially constructed. We've constructed socially groups based on sociolinguistic, socio-political needs, which is what this is, right? So let's look at two attributions of groupism. So two attributes Alright, so two attributes of groupism. And there's a lot of room for development here, so graduate students who might be interested in, I'm doing this for you guys, obviously. I think it's important, for me, just a quick side note, it's important to make sure that while I'm young and my mind is fresh and I'm reading daily and I'm writing daily, that when I come about sort of realization for potential research topics, new ideas, new things that we can flesh out. There's only so much work I can do between my writing, between my lecturing, between being a father and a husband and all my sort of social obligations. It's important to share with you, emerging scholars, the potential growth, because I can't write everything. I can't do everything. There's huge room for development in terms of this section on the 2 attributions for groupism. So if you're looking for potential research topic, articles and stuff, just pay particular note to this section because I thought the author's insight was profoundly sort of astute. So graduate students should ask themselves the following question. And here's the question. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions needed to articulate group agency and group interests? Right? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions needed to articulate group agency and group interests? So just really quick, before we continue, the distinctions between necessity and sufficiency. Let me see. Alright, so the distinctions between necessity and sufficiency. I might have done this in a lecture series before. I do this often in my residential lectures at the university. But it's important to make distinctions. One of the sort of key distinctions that can be made is, and it's the simplest, is this is called a conditional. Anything to the left of the conditional is called the antecedent. Anything to the right of the conditional is called the consequence. Excuse me. In language, linguistically, we would say if something happens, T-H-E-N, not A-N. If something happens, then something happens. This is called a conditional statement. If this happens, then this happens. The antecedent is sufficient, and the consequence is necessary. So anything to the left of the if statement in your conditional, the if section of your conditional statement is always sufficient. The then statement of your conditional is always necessary. So that's one sort of, for those of you who understand logic, that's one a little bit more advanced way of explaining this. So I'm going to give you an even simpler way of saying this. But in terms of necessity and sufficiency, the antecedent is always sufficient for the condition, the necessary condition of the consequence, right? To be technical. And I know that most of you won't understand that, but for those of you who do understand that, that's for you guys. In terms of a simpler way of explaining this, I always think of elements within a set. So imagine that we're trying to arrive at some condition D, and I say that elements A, B, C are needed. A, B, C are needed to constitute D. I need all of these elements in order to constitute this element. Any individual aspect, any individual element, A alone in and of itself is necessary but not sufficient. It isn't enough to give us, we need this, it's definitely necessary, but it's not sufficient in order to give us D. So A would be necessary, but not sufficient for D. B would be necessary, but not sufficient for D. C would be necessary, but not sufficient for D. However, A through C would be sufficient. Right? A through C is sufficient, right? There's enough here in order to constitute this element. So if we're talking about necessary and sufficiency, and the way that you can think about this, the example that I always give, imagine that you're going to make a bowl of cereal in the morning. What do you need? Let's say all the elements, and I'm sure you can make this more refined, but let's say you need the cereal, a bowl, milk, and a spoon. So you need 4 elements. In order to have a bowl of cereal, you need 4 elements. You need the cereal, the bowl, milk, and a spoon. If you just have a spoon, you don't have enough in order to have a bowl of cereal. If you just have the milk, you don't have enough to have a bowl of cereal, and on and on and on. So in order to have a bowl of cereal, you need the sufficient set, which would be all 4 elements. Any individual element is necessary, you do need it, but it's not enough. It's not sufficient. All 4 elements constitutes the sufficiency needed for a bowl of cereal. That should have explained the distinction between necessity and sufficiency, right? So we need to understand that in order to understand what's coming next. For those of you who understand logic, we can sort of consolidate really quick, and our antecedent is always going to be necessary for the sufficiency of a consequence, and that's basically saying that, but quicker. Okay, so what are the necessary, so now we're asking ourselves, right, in terms of group now, we need to understand the distinctions of the necessary and sufficient conditions needed to articulate, sociolinguistically, group agency and group interests, right? So, 1, agency, or entities, agency, right? Agency, aka entities, the ontological attempt to attribute uniform general characteristics to the group, on the one hand, and in so doing, the application of agency. So, entities, or group agency, is the ontological attempt to attribute uniform general characteristics. Right? Uniform general characteristics, the attempt to attribute these characteristics to the group. So, we try and make an attribution of uniform general characteristics to the group. Right? And this would be the process of attribution. Alright, the ontological attempt to attribute uniform general characteristics to the group, on the one hand, and in so doing, the application of agency. So, remember what I said in a pejorative sense. In terms of ethnicity and race, it's sort of hard to talk about ethnicity without talking about race. I recognize that this series is about ethnicity and nationalism, but prior to getting to nationalism, I want to make sure that we have a very robust understanding of the concept of ethnicity, sort of ethnical conflict and ethnical identity. That idea of the latter, ethnical identity, is itself based on the ability to demarcate groups. Ethnical identity is itself contingent on the ability to demarcate ethnical groups. In terms of ethnical groups, the author is talking about this concept of groupism. We recognize that his argument is, and many people might not accept this, you might not want to assume this position, I happen to like this position, but what he's saying is, let's be careful in the assumptions that we make, because we are assuming that ethnical groups exists as an ontological fact of reality, rather than as a consequence of our sociolinguistic ability to construct a narrative that forces us to see ethnic groups. And this is what he believes, and what I might believe as well. In terms of the attribution of characteristics, uniform characteristics, the problem with attributing uniform characteristics to an ethnical group is what? Well, I mean, you can pause it for a little bit and think. Remember what we said in the end of the last video, right, section 1. If you look at the idea of the Sambo, we recognize that, well, you generalize across a population if you seek to attribute uniform behavioral characteristics to a group. Later in either this series or the next, I don't want to go too much ahead because, I want to stay structured. It doesn't necessarily have to be pejorative. It doesn't have to be like the Sambo, and the Sambo's lazy and tired and submissive and weak and feeble. Asian Americans, I erased Asian Americans have, this lecture series is primarily focused towards an understanding of relationships and identity based on ethnicity, in terms of the United States of America, as an example, Asian Americans have a generalized attribution. There's a uniform characteristic, there's a uniform identity that has been attributed to the group, and that's one of being, educated, being super smart, being the smartest, even more smart than whites. Is that always the case? No, of course it's not the case, right? Of course it's not the case. So the idea is the author lends credibility to his argument by identifying any number of counterexamples. Why? Because it's difficult, if not impossible, I would say probably impossible, to be able to essentialize, right? Essentialize these uniform general characteristics to the entire group population. So if you don't have these essentializing characteristics that can be on sort of mass applied to ethnical groupings, and you have to make exceptions for any number of instances, it weakens the authoritative might of the concept of being a group. I know this argument is a little bit more advanced, but the idea is if you are making the assumptions that ethnical groups inhere as an ontological fact of our existence rather than socially constructed, then you are in the position to have to defend the numerous counterexamples when you talk about ethnical group characteristics and instances of nonconformity arise every time. Oh no, here's the black guy who isn't lazy, or here's the Asian guy who isn't smart, or here's the white guy who isn't good at business, and here's this guy that, and on and on and on and on and on. No, the idea of group dynamics already it starts to erode a bit. Now, granted, what the author is doing is very heady. This is a very heady move. We need the word group has sociological, sociolinguistic meaning. He's not saying we need to get rid of the word group. We understand what an ethnical group is. It's not to say that ethnical groups don't exist. What it is to say is that ethnical groups exist exclusively as a consequence of social construction. That's the point that's being made here. I want to be very clear about that, right? It's not that ethnical groups don't exist. They do exist. But ethnical groups don't exist like the gravitational constant exists. Two different types of existence. The gravitational constant is an existence, if you will, that is independent to social construction. It exists as such. Ethnical group identification does not exist like the gravitational constant. Ethnical group identification exists as a product of social construction and only as a product of social construction. And I personally think that that's undeniable. So, next point, by invoking group, they seek to evoke them, summon them, call them into being. They, the general population, produce what they apparently describe or designate. So that the idea is, insofar, this sounds almost mystical, right, this language, but insofar as I evoke the word group, the evocation in and of itself is sufficient enough to constitute an understanding of what I mean. Just the word they, right? So, blacks are ... Asians are ... Kurds are ... Right? The idea that I could evoke the group and that it has sociolinguistic meaning means that once I hear the word group, once I hear the ethnical group, I look into the world to see if I can identify the source, the referent for that word. So the word has a referent. So blacks are ... And I look into the world. Can I find blacks? I can find blacks. There's a correlation between what was said and what is seen, and my brain makes the link. And that's all you need to do. But the idea is we have socially constructed that distinction in blackness, in whiteness, in Hispanic identity and Asian identity and such. And I don't want to belabor the point, so I think that is clear. What we have then done is members of the general population, what we've done, and more, I think more astutely, those within academia who use these concepts in order to do any number of things. What we've done is insofar as we've made the distinction, we necessitate a sociolinguistic transformation in how we speak. Now our language has to reflect this distinctiveness. And the more we begin to parse humanity into subgroups and subpopulations rather than just talking about human beings, the more our language needs to continually evolve, the more we need to adapt new nomenclature and new ways of talking about even more nuanced distinctions. And you better believe that as we evolve, we're going to continue to parse the species of human beings into more refined distinctions, ethnical, social, religious, national, what have you. I would argue it's even probably going to get to genetic eventually. And we're going to have to adapt new words in order to talk about the new modes of distinctions that we've separated. Right? We've separated the population into categories, and thus there has to be a corresponding language that refers to, that points to these objective distinctions that we've created. So that's the first. The second applies to interests. So interests are obviously generalized. Interests are obviously generalized through the group. This was a typo. Through the group, which necessitates the attempts to homogenize interests, increases the likelihood for intragroup alienation, resentment, and violence. So the idea is, in terms of group interests, right? In terms of attributing this idea of groupism to ethnical populations, we want to say that ethnical populations have interests, right? And there's nothing new here, right? Blacks are interested in this, whites are interested in this, Asians are interested in that. In terms of the nature of interests themselves, however, what's important, it necessitates the attempt, again, to homogenize interests. There's an assumption, even in talking about interests, that all members of the group share the same respective interests, and that's clearly not true, right? Interests are going to be multifaceted. Interests are going to be within any ethnical group identification, and this is an important point, right? Within any ethnical group identification, interests are always going to be multifaceted. Any attempt to unify group interests, any attempt to consolidate group interests, homogenizes interests across the ethnical group. Right, we're making an assumption that they have this shared interest. Why might this happen? Right? Why might we need to assume a uniformity of interests within an ethnical subgrouping? Okay, obviously for socio-political reasons, right? Again, as I said in the first lecture series on this topic, section 1, the political establishment does not interact with individual people, right, in terms of its governance. It does not interact with individual people. It interacts with representatives and with groups. In terms of representation, the way in which needs are most effectively, until someone develops some, and this is specifically where there could be new research for aspiring graduate students. Now, there is an attempt, so I'll draw this out, right, in terms of the political establishment and the needs of the people. We have sort of the consolidation of people into a group, and group X elects representative X, and the political establishment deals with representative X, right? So you have a consolidated group, group X elects representative X, and the political while I was off for a year, I actually wrote a little bit about this. It's funny that this popped up, I just thought about that. The political establishment deals with, they interact with representative X on behalf of. So, right, representative X interacts with the political establishment on behalf of the needs of the people, group X. He, she, the representative, is going to take the interests of the people to the political establishment. What you need, and this is a very simple point, what you need to recognize is that insofar as the political establishment is dealing with representatives and their interests on behalf of the people, the interests are themselves always already homogenized. The interests, and this is a really nuanced point, but it's very important, right? The interests of the people as represented through a representative is always already homogenized. The representative, him or herself, cannot conceivably take all the interests of the people for which he or she is said to represent to the political establishment. No. What is he going to do? What is she going to do? They're going to take the most important topics of interest to the political establishment. Here are the things in my county, in my jurisdiction, in my thing, in my social movement, in my blah, 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 that the majority of those people who are currently marginalized need to have addressed. And the political establishment is going to consider those and such. But the idea is, through the process of representation, period, no matter how you think of this, the needs are always already homogenized, which means that there is, and this is what I haven't read any research on, and this is what I think would be cool for graduate researchers to sort of conceptualize 21st century, is there's a twofold marginalization that's occurring. Spivak might specifically, Spivak's conception of subalternity might address this. I don't want to get into that. It's a bit tangential, but you can imagine that the majority of the needs of the people are needs X, but this individual, this specific individual, has a need Y. This is just sort of ghetto philosophy, so you get the idea. So, this entire group is already marginalized. This is a marginalized group. The marginalized group elects a representative on their behalf to interact with the political establishment. So, marginalized group X elects representative X and takes interest X to the political establishment. We want interest X met. Part of that marginalized group has a member who has a different interests. The interest is Y. I am a member of marginalized group X, but I think what's more important than X is some other interests that I have, Y. You can see that the needs of Y are never going to be met. They're never going to be met. Why? Because there isn't enough social, it's called social capital. I'll talk about this in another lecture series. There isn't enough social capital to have needs Y met. The story of this person and his or her needs is twofold marginalization. I'm already a member of a marginalized population. That's population X. I have been lumped into this group X, and we have a representative, but my interests aren't the interests that the representative is articulating. I have different interests. What you can recognize here, and I think this would be amazing qualitative research, what you can recognize here in terms of ethnical identity, if you start thinking about interest-based issues, not ethnical or racial-based issues, you can see how you can have, quickly, you could formulate a coalition of any number of ethnical identities based around interest and not ethnicity, based around interest and not race, based around interest and not socioeconomic class and such, right? So that an interest-focused modality of organization is yet another way, because this person would be disenfranchised. Well, I mean, you guys are arguing on behalf of Group X, which I am a member, for need or interest X, for which I have no interest in, so I'm going to leave the group and I'm going to try and find people who are interested in Y. Your interest in Y might not be a contingency of your ethnical identity, so you might have blacks and whites and Hispanics and Jews, Gentiles, what have you, blah, blah, blah. We're going to start our own group based on Y, elect our own representative, and the political establishment is going to interact with our representative, and such and such and such. Huge, 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 huge room for new social dynamics in terms of representation. Social capital would be huge in this. Political interactivity with socio-political interaction is huge. There's just a ton of new research that can be done with this sort of general concept. So anytime you're talking about group identity, you have to recognize that ethnical identity as the constituent element of group identity is a given. More nuanced distinction is the formalization of group identity, not based on ethnical or race identity, but based on interest, is important. And the way in which interest-based needs are facilitated via representation is about as specific as it gets, right? It's about as specific as it gets. Okay, so that was a little overkill, but you know, why not? All right, so next, the 4 tenets of groupism. All right, so I want to go through and talk about the 4 tenets of groupism. All right, so to move beyond groupism, we emphasize the socio-political function of the group and the sense of being. One, not the being of the group, but the sense of being in the group. Right? So we want to make a distinction between sort of the ontology of the group, which obviously we recognize now. At least my bias, the way that I'm teaching this, is that the ontology of the group exists only as a product of social construction, right? But not the being of the group, but being in the group. So, groupness as event. And I really liked the author's sort of account, his insight. So key, the feeling of collective solidarity. It isn't so much about the group as an ontological reality that's of any importance, but the feeling of collective solidarity. When I'm with members of this group, insofar as we are organizing ourselves for political representation, in order to have our needs met or what have you, I have a sense of community. I have a feeling of belongingness, right? So that solidarity, it manifests in a feeling of belonging, right? That feeling of belonging. The conceptualization of groupness is that of an event, an occurrence, a happening that comes into being and potentially disintegrates, right? It is a coming together. Right? It is a sense that I have created, I have constructed, I am a member of an event that is occurring. So you might have a march in protest, or you might have a sit-in, or you might have a fast, or you might have any number of socially constructed protests in order to identify the group. And insofar as the group is identified, it's identified via the event. So that we come to know of the group, and we put group now in quotes, we come to know epistemically of the group through, by means of, the event. Right? So the event, really, the event is the means with which we formalize group identification. I mean, that's just, for me, that's dope. I like that, right? We come to know of group, because if you think about it, yeah, duh, that makes sense, right? We come to know of the group via the event and events that are held by the groups, which leads you to what conclusion? Well, it should be obvious, graduate students. What does that lead you to, right? The more events that the group has, the more likely it is to be known. Duh. If you're one of those groups that sit around and you plan something every year, probably never going to hear you. If you're one of those groups that are doing something every month, I might hear about you. If you're one of those groups that are doing something every week, I'm probably going to hear about you. If you're one of those groups that are doing something every day, I'm going to know who you are. Right? We come to know of group identification because of the frequency with which the group has events. Hey, we're going to be at such and such time. We're going to mobilize, we're going to localize, we're going to get on the cell phones and coordinate. I'm going to meet you up on Facebook and Twitter and blah, 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 and we're going to have feeds together, and I'm going to be there. Be there with me at such and such time. Bob, bring your friends. Mary, bring your friends. Let's all meet. Right? So that we come to know of group identification through the event. If you're talking about social movements and social activism, I think one of the key things that we need to recognize, quick tangent, is that we should be using social media as a means of meeting in the real world. If your social movement is completely based on virtual interactivity and exclusively based on virtual interactivity, you're not going to have a really, really effective social movement. the idea is to use the virtual community as a mode of coordinating action, as a mode of coordinating disparate communities of individuals. But at the end of the day, we live in the real world still, and as long as we live in the real world, you're going to have to do something in the real world, right? So that the idea is we come to know of the group, thus we come epistemologically, to know of group identification via the event. And I just think that's absolutely genius. All of this, I think there's tons and tons of room for contemporary research on this topic, so I encourage graduate students to look deeper into some of these. I don't have the time to go through and parse through every bit, but I think this is absolutely critical. This is 1C, the conceptualization in accordance with mobilization. That's sort of what I'm saying. So, conceptualization in accordance with mobilization. We come to know, conceptualize, group identification via mobilization. Show me. Where are you? Oh, you're at the protest at such and such corner with such and such? Okay, no problem. Okay, your group does exist. Oh, you've mobilized people? Okay, fine. I mean, you got a Twitter feed, and you got 25,000 people watching you. I'm less interested in your Twitter feed, right? You got a Twitter feed with 25,000 people, and that Twitter feed led to 15,000 people mobilizing on the corner of XYZ? Wow, you're doing something, right? So the idea is social media, social interactivity is a means of mobilization, and it is in this mobilization within the real world that we collectively come to know, conceptualize. So conceptualization in accordance with mobilization means just that, right? The event becomes the conduit with which we come to identify the group, but the truth of the matter is that the group is still socially constructed. The group really does not exist in the real world. The group is almost interchangeable with the event, and it's through the event that we come to know of the group. If that's the case, and I believe that I agree with the author, that that is the case, then the frequency of the event or the magnitude of the event facilitates a more entrenched group identification. Your group becomes more entrenched, the identity becomes more solidified the larger your event. You have an event with 25,000, 50,000 people, okay, this group is official. You guys are doing something every single day, every single week, okay, this group is official, right? Where you can't get large numbers, you should increase frequency. And such. So, number 2 is group as category. Group as category. Groupness is a category of identification and a means of accessing the epistemol. Jason. Sorry. Groupness is a category of identification and a means of accessing the epistemology of its organization. Groupness is a category of identification. Okay, we talked about that. And a means of accessing the epistemology of its organization. Okay, it's very complicated. I'll explain that. That is a coming to understand how group functions and identifies itself as a group. So, one concept is group as event. Another concept is group as category. How do we come to understand group? Group becomes a category. So we can imagine that group is a category, and what we've done is we've taken ideas, idea 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's the way in which we categorize these ideas. It's the way, and I'll give you an example. It's the ways in which we categorize these ideas and the social means of mobilizing based on those ideas that we formalize the group. This one's a little bit different. So, first thing that comes to my mind would be PETA, right? PETA is undeniably a group, right? It's not an ethnical group, and all of this applies to ethnicity, but I want to make this sort of simple. PETA is a very distinct group. It's like really, I know that there's other types, but PETA is one of those groups that its identity is so entrenched because of frequency and size, but also because of categorization. It's part ethics movement. It's part animal movement. It's part recognition of privilege movement. It's definitely social movement. You take all of those ideas, those categories of thought, and you solidify it into one concept, into one thing, and it becomes PETA, right? People for the ethical treatment of animals. And what is that? Well, it's people for the ethical treatment of animals. If you get rid of the E, you don't have PETA. There's an ethics basis there, right? This ethic basis is about morals, about what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. It's very, very powerful. No one's going to deny the power of ethics. Me personally, I would say that the E in PETA is less provocative than it probably could be. Their ethics is okay, I guess. It's more shock what I've seen from PETA and less real hardcore ethics that I've seen. But the E is probably one of the most powerful forces on the planet, the ethics, what you ought to do. And here's a justification why you ought to do this or ought not to do that, right? But we recognize that the ethics is different from a recognition that, you know, animals ought to be treated in this particular manner. Why? Why ought they? Well, you know, the argument is, well, I eat meat and I'm going to continue to eat meat and nothing that PETA says or does is going to persuade me not to. How do they respond to that? Right? How does the group categorize antithetical positions? How does it identify itself in relationship to antithetical positions? And on and on and on and on and on. So that the idea of the group can be a little bit more abstract. It's not just, well, I can see and understand the group because there's an event. It's the way in which I categorize the function of the group. This group functions in accordance with the defense of rights for animals. Well, do animals have rights? Yeah, they do. Well, show me how they have rights. Well, here's the ethical argument for how they have rights. Well, I'm still going to eat meat. Well, don't you understand that there are alternatives? Oh, wow, now you're a little bit more persuasive. Now I sort of understand. Oh, okay. Maybe I'll give a nod to the movement. The idea is the way in which the group categorizes conceptually the ideas that facilitate group identification is another mode of, and I could do more, but I'm realizing that I've been lecturing for already an hour and 15 minutes, so I need to sort of push this along. Now, in terms of ethnography, what might this look like? So the first bit, this is the top of page 5. Ethnography, cohabitation, shared linguistic fluency become essential in our attempt to understand group cohesion. So ethnography, cohabitation, shared linguistic frequency become essential. So the fact that you have categorized yourself as a group isn't just based on genetic similarities, it's based on the fact that you guys share the same language. It's based on the fact that you guys live in roughly the same region. It's based on the fact that you guys have the same cultural practices. But it's not these things individually. It's the fact that you share the same language and, so this would be a conjunction, right? This would be and. This would be and. This would be and. It's the fact that you live in the same region and you share the same cultural practices and you share the same religious practices and you share the same language that you identify yourself as a group. Right? It's not just the religious practices or the cultural practices or the linguistic similarities that in and of themselves that is sufficient. It is the organization of all of these categories. And it's the fact that they're all conjoined that facilitate group identification, right? It's the fact that you live in this region and you have the same religious practices and you speak the same language and you have the same cultural, that group identification becomes solidified, right? If any of those, so just briefly, if any of those key elements of group identification in terms of category become destabilized, it will transform the nature of the group, undeniably. If any of those elements become destabilized, group identification becomes weakened. And usually what ends up happening is that you have a break within the group. Members of the group now identify themselves as a new group so that you can split this group, which could potentially cause more inter-group rivalry, inter-group conflict. Why? Categorization is key. Categorization is important. Understanding how the group, and I'm not going to go into this at all, but understanding how the group categorizes itself gives theorists accessibility to understanding what the identity of the group is. Okay, so that's 2. We only have 2 more elements. Number 3, my HD flip for whatever reason, it's got a, I don't know, like an ingrained glitch now where it trips out after an hour. What I'll do is, I'll try and sort that out, but you'll have to forgive me. I'm going to sort of bind the last section to this section. So the idea is the same. I was paying keen attention today when I saw the light trip out. So we were talking about group identification. So I'm just picking up where I just left off, right? So in terms of group identification, one means of coming to understand group identification pertains to potential violence, right? I come to solidify group identification based on this antithetical relationship with another group. What I was saying before, before the camera tripped out, was we have group categorization, the ideas that categorize the group. If there is a schism in the categories, there's a potential fracture in the identity. So you can think about being Christian as the overarching sort of group, the way in which the group is organized. Right? So, but that's very broad. And the example that I was talking about before the camera tripped out pertained to the religious rivalry in Ireland between Protestants and Catholics. Both members of the Christian community, undeniably. The tension is a consequence, partly, I mean any number of reasons, but with respect to Christianity itself, is a contingency on what distinguishes Protestants from Catholics. Right? Categories are shared, but those instances where the categories are no longer shared, that separation serves to reinforce the antithetical relationship between segments of the population. So this is the Protestant segment of the population, this is the Catholic segment of the population, and now we can go to part 3, group making as a project. This project is reinforced by an antithetical and implacable, a polemic conflict where identity is incommensurable. I cannot see a way in which we could ever cohabitate. In terms of ethnic violence, in terms of religious violence, primarily, this is all too frequent, right? There isn't an ability for members of, I wouldn't say necessarily a willingness, but there is an ability for members of either group to see a means how to resolve their conflict, right? So that the conflict becomes insurmountable, seemingly, and this is why you need third-party negotiators, third-party mediators to come in to help the group. Why? Because individuals from either section are so entrenched in the conflict that their entrenchment prevents them from resolving this conflict meaningfully, right? It becomes problematic, right? How the resolution to this conflict might unfold. So I'm not going to go too much into number 3. So group making as project, deliberate violence as a means of group making. That is, the existence of groupness may itself be a product of violence. And this happens, right? The idea is that violence can be used as a means of establishing and entrenching group identity. You can think of any movement to overthrow oppressive regimes. It's the oppressiveness of the regime that catalyzed group identification, right? So group making as a project, violence is critically important. But it's not just violence. You can think of socioeconomic disparity. In the United States of America, I would imagine that group identification might become group as project. We might understand the group as project. Why? Because the increasing disparity between our socioeconomic classes, such that conceivably the middle class is either eradicated or almost subsumed by poverty, is going to be a key constituent element in oppositional group identity to this socioeconomic disparity. So it doesn't have to be physical violence in and of itself that serves to catalyze group identification, though that is important, right? Physical violence as a mode of group identification, as a project for group identification. Similarly, there's socioeconomic oppression or religious oppression or heterosexuality as oppression that forms the basis, that catalyzes the basis for group identification. critically important as well. So it doesn't just have to be violence. So that's that. So group is project. J, sorry. And then lastly, 4, group as organization. So key, social mobilization is more difficult than implementing institutional control. And group as organization is very difficult, right? In terms of the organizing principles of the group, this isn't how the group is organized. This is the organization that the group does, which is mobilization. How does the group mobilize individuals around its common theme, around its cause, around its social functionality? How does the group do that? Well, the group is directed towards members of the community with these key demographic elements. And the cause that the group is fighting is for this. And the enemy, quote unquote, is this. Without these very basic requirements, the nature of the group is too amorphous, and the group will eventually dissipate. You guys have, for those of you who've been watching me, I haven't, in my life, I didn't grow up when Mandela grew up fighting an oppressive apartheid regime, and I didn't grow up in an era where the Nazis were doing the world's disservice by exterminating in whole enormous segments of the population, and there was that clear bad guy that you had to fight. I mean, I grow up now, I've come to age now in a world where the threat is more amorphous. But an amorphous threat in no sense constitutes an amorphous response to that threat. Though the threat may be amorphous, that is terror, we still need to have a very solidified, very concrete, very realized, very practical, very clearly demarcated response to an amorphous threat. This is precisely why. Now granted, Occupy Wall Street was not a social movement against terror, but I think the amorphous nature of threats in general, and this is something that you guys might want to explore in the future, graduate students specifically, in response to an amorphous threat, it seems that our social movements are now amorphous, right? I participated with Occupy. It was one of the first, if not the only social movement of any relevance since I've been alive. And I never participated in anything else because nothing ever seemed like it was going to be the next movement. And, Occupy came and Occupy went. I can say for certain that I contributed to the group. I tried to make sense of it. I went from a point of not knowing at all to knowing exactly, and I wasn't impressed. Why wasn't I impressed? Because group identification was not organized. There was no organizing principle. What was being fought wasn't clearly defined. How people were to participate and function in the group, the diversification of functionality, which is a completely different topic, wasn't clear. And it was that amorphous nature of the social movement that led to its collapse. The idea is effective group identification has, all the power in the world to egalitarianism and such. I'm not a member of that group. I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe effective social organization requires effective hierarchy. It requires a clear understanding of functionality and duty, a clear understanding of principle, a clear ethic, someone or something or some concept that is the source for group identification, and it's that thing that we, members of the group, are fighting against. If it's something real, then it's a physical fight. If it's something conceptual, then it's an intellectual fight. And we win intellectual war through representation, through mobilization, through transformation of huge swaths of the population that would otherwise be subsumed to the other idea. And we get people to believe our idea, not their idea. If you're not doing that, then there's no way that group cohesion is going to be maintained. So I think the genius of the author's account, and why I absolutely had to incorporate it in this lecture series, in my lecture series on ethnicity and nationalism, is we need to challenge the assumption of group as an ontological reality. Groupness And group identification is constructed socially, like everything else that we construct socially. When we talk about group, we're talking about the group. We might be talking about the group as the event. We come to know the group because of the events that are had. Or we might talk about the group not as event, but the group as the organization of categories, right? The categories of ideas are organized, the conjunction of which these sets of ideas constitutes the group. We might talk about the group as project, the group as breaking off from this categorization, and the group as a project in response to some threat, in response to some sense of oppression and such. Or we might talk about, finally, the group as we just did, as a project, right? The group as, or as an organization, I said project. The group as an organization and an organizing element of society. The group as being able to take members of the population and attract them to the central theme of the group. And when people come, instead of doing what Occupy Wall Street did, which, I mean, shout out to Occupy for the attempt, but they had huge numbers turn out. People were interested in coming, but when they came, it was a more egalitarian structure. If it was more hierarchical, if I solicit you to come and watch my videos, when you come to see my videos, I'm not freestyling this. I took time to read. I've prepared. There's notes. My discussion is guided. There are things that you need to think about or not. I want you to read this or not. When people come, as an academic, I have something for you to do. It's not just, hey, look what I can do. Hey, let's sit around and talk. No. The difficult part was getting you mobilized and getting you to come. Now that you come, you have expectations. Now that you come, since you've come to see me, I have something for you to do. Bob, do this. Mary, do that. What are you good at? Tim, I need you to do this. There are 5 things that this group does. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pick one of those things that you do well and get in that group. You get into that group, we've elected representatives for function 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Talk to Bob, talk to Mary, who's the head of group 1, 2, 3, or segment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Further and further diversification until group functionality is mechanical and beautiful. That's what it's all about. So that in terms of ethnical identification, you can see how ethnical identification facilitates exactly the same functionality, that it's not just their ethnicity. At the end of the day, it's not the fact that there's some genetic relationship, this idea of kinship, that's the sole motivating force facilitating the cohesion of the group. No, that's not it. What is it? It's these 4 elements, right? It's these 4 elements that I just went through, right? These are the things, these elements are the things that are preserving group identification. I think an understanding of these 4 elements when you're doing your research will inform how you read your text. If you go into your text with the understanding that group identification is facilitated by the 4 elements that are discussed, when you're reading and when you're looking in field, you will be able to see, you'll be able to see operationally these 4 elements in operational function, which will help facilitate a more precise account of the dynamics that you're observing. So that's going to conclude section 1.1 of my lecture series of ethnicity and nationalism. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.